Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills are videos where I talk about the books that I have recently finished reading. We're getting late into September, and I am behind on these videos. So I'm going to talk about 3 books today, and I'm going to try and do it quickly, but we'll see how that goes. I have 2 nonfiction books and a fiction book, so I'm going to be talking about the Secular Enlightenment, Passionate Sage, and also Wuthering Heights. I'm going to discuss them, I guess, in the order in which I read them. So I'm going to start off with this one. The Secular Enlightenment by Margaret C. Jacob. This is from Princeton University Press. I believe it was published in 2019. And I had gotten this as part of a book haul when Princeton University had a sale in the early part of the year. At that time, I was doing a 50 book challenge, book buying challenge, basically where I wouldn't buy another new book unless I had read 50 books that I already had. And there were a couple exceptions to that. I was allowing myself to buy a book a month for buddy reads. And I kind of broke the rule halfway through, partly because I was getting bored with the with the challenge, but also Princeton was having such a good sale. I really didn't want to pass it up. I felt dumb if I let it go. And the way that I sort of justified all that was I vowed to read those books before the end of the year, so that they were not books that were just going to sit on my shelf and collect dust. And this was one of them. And this subject matter is something that I have always been very interested in. I am by nature, a very secular person, always have been. The Enlightenment, I think, is a fascinating period of time. So the Secular Enlightenment in particular is going to be something that is really right up my alley. And for the most part, this really was. This is a very general look at the secular aspects of the Enlightenment. It's the kind of book that I think will whet your appetite for further research. It doesn't go super in depth into any one particular thing, so it kind of gives you a survey. The first couple of chapters really focus on life in the Enlightenment and how it became more and more secularized. There was essentially, especially in the 18th century, a sort of a mental shift that occurred, where we saw people worrying less and less about religious matters, about the destiny of their soul and the hereafter, and we see them thinking and concentrating more and just basically engaging with far more secular things. They're thinking more about their careers or, what they're going to have for dinner. It seems to be more of a mental shift where they are less concerned with religion and devote way more mental energy to things that are not religious. Now, again, this doesn't mean that many of them became atheists. She kind of wants to make that clear. There are certainly some that did. But really what we're talking about is a mental shift where people's daily lives just become more and more secular and far less concerned with religious matters. Now, of course, there were some who did start to have major religious shifts as well. You had some people who started redefining God in new ways in order to, make things match more with empirical evidence, with the natural world that they saw. And you had some, which albeit a minority, who did abandon God pretty much altogether. That is not the main focus here. Those things do appear. In the first part, though, like I said, a lot of it has to do with people's changing notions of time, how they clock their day, the kinds of things they were concerned with, what they were reading. And actually 2 of my favorite parts of this, I would say, have to do with a chapter, I think it's called Secular Lives. I'm just going to double check that. One of the Secular Lives, and it's basically little snippets of average people. I guess, not all of them were poor, middle class, but fairly average people and how we see them become secularized. We do have, one of them really stood out to me, a Dutch freethinker, a woman named Isabella de Meurlus. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but she seemed quite interesting. She pretty much, she wrote copiously. She published her own autobiography, which is 600 pages. She seems to have been somebody who pretty much argued with clergy all the time, was, widely read. And it says in her autobiography, which is over 600 pages, that makes it clear her disillusionment with the Catholic clergy, indeed her general disdain for the structures of organized religion, and her willingness to discuss sexual matters explicitly, everything from menstruation to coitus interruptus to fellatio. So this was quite a woman ahead of her time, and she probably died around 1712. And I think that she died maybe in prison for being mentally ill, but it's kind of, that stuff is very mysterious. We don't know a lot about that. So who knows exactly where she was going or how she ended up there. But she seems to have been quite a pistol when she was around. And it's just fascinating to think about people like that, at the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century. My favorite chapter, though, is almost towards the middle. And it's called, I'm just going to look for it here, Paris and the Materialist Alternative, the Widow Stockdorf. So this woman, a widow, Stockdorf, she was from Strasbourg, I think. She basically in 1771 went to Paris, and she had, I guess, a book bag, and she had a shopping list. And it was basically, the shopping list was all the forbidden books that she was trying to get. Things that, disparaged religion, and things that were basically illegal under the Catholic Church and the French laws at the time. So she was heading to Paris. She ends up getting caught by the authorities. They have her list. And I think that the bookseller or something like that ended up in the Bastille. I don't remember all the details exactly. But what Jacob essentially does is look at her shopping list. And then we go through and look at what those books were, or at least what we know about them, to see the kinds of books that she was getting. And she was trying to get the real profound stuff, the creme de la creme of some of the more heretical things. So those little insights into quotidian life during the secular, the secular Enlightenment, or at least the secular portion of the Enlightenment, I just find completely fascinating. The second half of the book, she concentrates more on the way the secular Enlightenment played out in different areas, basically different countries. And that, of course, depending on how strict the religious laws were, especially in those countries, depended on how much secularization could really occur. So in some countries, it can go pretty far. In others, they dare not let it go too far. Otherwise, they'd be, arrested, who knows, maybe even executed. So that stuff is kind of interesting. I think we see Germany, we see Italy, we see different countries. It's not quite as engaging, maybe, as some of the stuff in the beginning. But overall, I enjoyed this book. Again, I think it's more of one to whet your appetite for further research. So it definitely did for me. So I'm glad I read this. Then I went and I read Wuthering Heights. This is a copy, I think, from 1936. It's just the one that I happen to have. It's kind of cool to be able to, read books in this kind of old edition. I have been reading over the past, I guess maybe it's been 2 years now or so, reading older Gothic works. A lot of it has to do with my fascination with the horror genre. I do not consider myself well-read at all in the horror genre, but I am well-watched. I'm a big horror movie fan, always have been my whole life, and I am wanting to know more and more about how the genre developed before cinema. And, of course, that would largely be the Gothic. So I've been reading Gothic works, sometimes with groups with me, with reading groups. This one I ended up reading on my own. From the 18th century all the way up to, I'm down to the middle of the 19th century. And, by the end of the year, I kind of want to work my way into the 20th and start getting into more modern horror. So, of course, Wuthering Heights isn't exactly horror, but it is very Gothic. Now, I should probably explain my expectations with this. Of course, when I was younger, by younger I mean even maybe a few years ago, when I heard Wuthering Heights, my mind automatically went to, I thought more like, it was kind of like Jane Austen, but with a lot more wind through people's hair. I thought that that's maybe what Wuthering Heights is going to be. It sounds like that in a lot of ways. And then, of course, being on booktube and, watching other people's discussions of it, I at least came away, or I was prepared to have it not exactly be that. I knew that it was a darker book than many people expect it to be. However, I had already read Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre a few years ago, and I really enjoyed that. I liked that quite a bit. And that is still basically a romance. Now, I did not expect, well, I would say I expected this to also be a romance, even if it's a dark gothic romance. And I had heard people say, I don't really like Heathcliff, I don't find him romantic. So I thought that at least he would be kind of a romantic interest in this. So I thought I was kind of prepared for what this book was, but I really still even wasn't. This is not a romance at all. Heathcliff, he is not meant in any way, I think, to be attractive to the reader. I didn't expect him to be basically a villain. Now, we kind of have a little bit of a ghost sighting in the beginning of this, which I really liked. I think it's left up to a little bit of ambiguity. Was the person dreaming? Were they not? But still, it's a pretty effective scene when it comes. And then the book, essentially, so some big things that surprised me. I didn't expect the main narrator to be a housekeeper. I didn't know that we were going to see most of the book through her eyes. I didn't know that this was a multi-generational story. I knew about Heathcliff and Cathy. I knew those two names. And I figured that they were going to be basically the majority of the book, but they're actually really not. And again, I'm trying to be very vague. I don't want to give spoilers away. Instead, we get essentially 3 generations worth, at least, two full generations of, with a few square miles. And it's 2 essential, basically farmhouses or manor houses. You got Wuthering Heights, and you got, Thrush Crush Grange, I believe is the other one. The entire novel takes place within those couple square miles, and there's kind of this wilderness of the Yorkshire Moors, I think we're at. Again, I could be wrong about some of these things from my memory, but it all takes place within there, and we basically keep going back and forth between these 2 estates. And the people mostly are largely despicable to each other. There are moments of surprising violence that I didn't expect, and just outright cruelty. Very vindictive characters in this. Heathcliff, no, he's not likable at all. And again, I don't think necessarily he's supposed to be. Cathy, I didn't like Cathy either. But again, I think that these are supposed to be very flawed people who, yeah, I mean, there's maybe a certain romantic quality where they seem sort of made for each other, but they're both not very good people. I ended up liking Cathy Jr., I will say. I thought she was actually a really good character, and I liked Nellie, the narrator. But again, this, without getting too into it, this is a novel that surprised me, even though I knew I was going to be surprised to a certain extent. It surprised me more than I expected to, and I did like it. I liked it quite a bit. I wonder if I was even more prepared, if I would have maybe liked it even more, because I wasn't really expecting that multi-generational aspect, so it was really kind of difficult to see where the story was going, why. I wasn't quite sure. It is a kind of book, I think, where you ask a little bit, like, what's the point? But I think a lot of it has to do with certain emotions and motivations that we see going through the book, especially this kind of how a sort of vindictive quality can really start eating away at one. So I like this. I liked it quite a bit. It was darker and more gothic in a lot of ways than I expected it to be, even though I expected a little bit of that. I don't know if I can compare it really to Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is still largely a straightforward narrative that is still ultimately a love story, and this definitely is not. So Emily Brontë, who, again, this was published, 1847? I think she died maybe a year after. I know that she's more the kind of quiet, reserved one. She seems like she would have been quite an interesting person based on this. And I can understand why this was so scandalous in a lot of ways when it first came out. But yeah, again, I liked it. It was not entirely what I expected in a good way. And I really did enjoy this. And then I read Passionate Sage, The Character and Legacy of John Adams by Joseph J. Ellis. And I read this, and also I should have said Secular Enlightenment, I read for Historathon 2023. That is a year-long celebration of nonfiction history, We divided the year up into 4 quarters, each quarter looking at a different time period. The quarter that is coming to an end at the end of September, third quarter, looks at the years 1500 to 1820. And this was a book that I just had on my shelves for a long time, and I just really wanted to get to it, and I'm glad that I did. I'd say I ended up enjoying this way more than I expected to. I've read a couple things by Ellis before. I have read his work on Thomas Jefferson, which is American Sphinx, which I actually didn't really like his treatment there. He seems to be one of those people who always takes the least charitable interpretation when it comes to Jefferson. Jefferson, was he hypocritical? Yeah, he was. But that doesn't make him a mystery. And I think that when you look at how complicated his world was, you understand maybe where the hypocrisy came from. It's been a long time since I've read American Sphinx, so I don't remember all the details, but I remember coming away not really liking that book. And I also read his treatment of Washington, which is, I think it's his Excellency, I think that one is called. And at the time I read that, and I liked it. And I wonder if I read it today, if I would find it sort of hagiographic. I don't remember being very critical at all of Washington, and maybe he should have been. So I really didn't know what to do with this book, and especially, I'd say the title, Passionate Sage, seems almost hagiographic as well. It seems a little bit too, I don't know, sappy? I don't know exactly what word I'm looking for, especially with that mug looking at you. And when it comes to John Adams, I had read David McCullough's work, which I really like. I really love his biography. And of course, I've read a lot of revolutionary history or early republic history that deals with Adams as well. So we've read a lot of things that have him in it. So I was pretty familiar with Adams's life. So this, though, is not exactly, it's not a biography. This is a kind of a psychological examination of what kind of person Adams was. And I would say that that Jefferson book that I didn't really like was also that. But I think that Ellis does a much better job here with this. I think those sorts of analyses can go very wrong at times, but not here. I think that this actually strikes a pretty good balance for the most part. I do have one exception to all that. But essentially, he is looking at John Adams in his retirement years, after his presidency. And he is examining Adams through his own writing, through the things that people wrote about him, and basically saying what kind of person was he, what was his personality, and over time, because he lived for a long time after retirement. He was kind of already old, and I think he lived for over 20 years more than I think he was really expecting when he was getting older, and I think he expected to die a lot quicker than he did in life. So he hung out for a while. He stayed around for a while. So we see him change over time. We get insights into his personality. Ellis is also trying to get at the heart of his political philosophy through his writings, to kind of figure out what kind of worldview Adams had. And of course, we get the kind of person that we expect Adams to be. If you've read anything about him, he was cantankerous. He is very thin-skinned in a lot of ways. He was blustering, but he was very smart. And it seems like the people who really got to know him had a huge admiration for him. And I can understand why. He seems like, especially when he was an old man, something of a sage, right? You had the sage of, I think it's Montezillo is what he called his estate, jokingly, I think, which means like Little Mountain. He was a joking take on Jefferson's Monticello. So you kind of have the sage of Massachusetts with the sage of Virginia with Jefferson. And of course, towards the end of their lives, they were writing back and forth, and a terrific treasure of letters that produced. But he was also writing other people like Benjamin Rush, and some people he was a little more loose with his tongue than others. With Jefferson, he was actually a little more reserved. But all those things give us kind of an interesting insight into who Adams was. And I really did enjoy spending this time with him. He doesn't come off this does not come off as hagiographic as maybe the title would suggest. It's something that I think Ellis does a pretty good job pointing out his flaws as well as his strengths. Then I will say that by concentrating on Adams in his retirement years, we do also lose a very important insight into another part of his personality. One of the things that Ellis tries to do is also figure out why Adams was not as quickly revered or set among the pantheon as people like, of course, Washington. Washington became the untouchable on top of sort of Mount Olympus of the American Republic. But Jefferson certainly rose in prominence. Why were there no statues of John Adams? You know, why was Adams not somebody considered for Mount Rushmore? Why is there not an Adams monument in Washington, D.C.? And he goes through a lot of history behind that. I mean, for one thing, Adams was a terrific political thinker. He was not a great political philosopher, and he did not write nearly as well on such eloquently or memorably in ways that somebody like Jefferson did. So he's hard to point to in that way when you want to reference an early political philosophy. So he was not good at relating his political opinions in a lot of ways, even if he was a pretty good political thinker and very sharp. But because we only deal with his retirement, we are totally absent, basically, what I think is probably the main reason that Adams has not been as fondly remembered, and that's the Alien and Sedition Acts, which he signed into law during his presidency. The Alien Acts, in a lot of ways, are still in existence. They haven't been always enforced, but they haven't gone away. But the Sedition Acts, essentially making it illegal to presumably falsely speak of the administration, but pretty much he was locking up political enemies, newspapers who were against the Adams administration or the Federalist Party. They were seeing themselves thrown in jail. I mean, it was a horrible violation of freedom of speech. Very controversial when it was passed at the time, and a major contributing factor of him not being reelected, and thankfully allowed to expire during Jefferson's presidency. But there's really not a word in this, and it certainly would have been appropriate when we talk about his thin-skinned nature to really talk about what would make him sign into law something like the Alien and Sedition Acts. But of course, because we're talking about retirement, we get to miss that by about 2 years. Even though he does go back in time a few times, and he could have gone back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the biggest blight on Adams's record, this act, especially the Sedition Act, is absent in here. And it's certainly, I think, relevant to why Adams has not been as revered. It would be weird to, make a statue of a president who essentially, violated free speech. So, I mean, in all that being said, we're talking about a revolutionary generation that was still finding its way, and that was still figuring out ways to do things. And some of these revolutionaries had an easier time of that than others. We have sort of Adams, the realist, and versus Jefferson's idealism in a lot of ways. We see Adams and Jefferson as sort of these spiritual polar opposites of the revolution, but in each way that they oppose each other, there's other ways where they really complement each other. So I still come away from this. I like Adams. I don't know if I could spend a lot of time with him if I had to stay in a room with him for a long period of time. But, I think that you do come out of this with a respect for him. Although, like I said, I think there's something majorly lacking. What is in here, I really like. I thought it was well written, engaging, and I thought Ellis used the sources really, really well. I just think that there's a glaring omission here when it comes to how we remember Adams and why we remember him in the way that we do. So I would still recommend this, but with that thought in mind. So anyhow, I've been talking for over 20 minutes. Those are the 3 books that I finished really in the first part of September. I've got another book next to me that I finished reading, but I'm not going to talk about that yet until I get into another video. And right now, actually, I'm reading Conan, so that's something I hope to finish before the end of the month. So the books that I finished were The Secular Enlightenment, Wuthering Heights, and Passionate Sage. If you've read any of these, as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And also, as always, thank you, BookTube.